get Twitch powered up here on my phone so I can make sure that the stream is working. I should probably paste into the chat room that we are live. Gotta wait for the ad to play again. I'm excited to talk about a bunch of old school layout techniques. Let me get my browser and video up here in the corner. Is my audio working tonight? Leave that question out there. I think it's still all wired up together correctly. Yes, someone in the chat room has confirmed. Okay, so tonight I want to talk about some layout techniques that I was actually surprised were not covered in our textbook. We talk about floats and positioning a lot in this chapter, and I was expecting to see all the same approaches that we used to build the mid website. And what's good news is the techniques that we used to build the mid website are pretty much no longer needed for modern browsers like Chrome, Safari, and Edge. Now, unfortunately, if you're trying to support older browsers like Internet Explorer, some of the new techniques that are going to be covered in the next chapter, Flexbox it's called, and CSS Grid, just won't work with those old browsers. So our textbook author, when she published the 5th edition, decided to cut a chapter all about layout using floats. And I can kind of see why. This is honestly the hardest topic to talk about, and the only way that I was able to learn how to use floats effectively was a lot of trial and error. And if you poke through the source code of the midmish.edu website, you're probably going to see probably some CSS comments from me that say that this, I don't know why this worked, or that I needed an extra container because of such and such problem. So it was kind of a pain to get floats and divs within divs to work. And the good news is that the W3C acknowledged that, and they spent a lot of time making new design tools so that you didn't have to use the float property to lay out a whole website. So that's the good news, and we're going to talk a little bit about that next week. The bad news is if you're trying to make a website that works well on a bunch of browsers, you still do need some of these float techniques. So I have decided to pare down that article that I posted in Moodle tonight to just 2 layouts that I wanted to use as a demonstration. And what I know to be true is that the CSS Zen Garden HTML is actually uniquely optimized because it has so many divs with IDs and classes on it, where positioning with floats is probably a very good idea. So this week and the extra chapter are going to be very important for you when you're building your midterm. So let's get started. I have made an excerpt from this article that I'm going to post in Moodle as well. Tonight, I want to talk about making a 2-column fluid layout and a variation of that is a 2-column layout that has a fixed width. So first, let's kind of pair that apart. What do I mean by a fluid layout? Well, let me open up my fluid example, and this file will be posted on Moodle for you to look at later. And I'll show the HTML and the CSS in a minute. As I resize this browser window, you'll see that this main article always takes up about, I think it's 70% of the width. And the sidebar here where you might put your nav bar has a much smaller amount of width. And as the web page grows, those percentages are kept and the content can grow inside of it. This is a very common design that you'll see on news websites and blogs. it might look ridiculous on a super, super, super big screen, and it might still look a little awkward on a very small phone screen, but it does resize nicely. So that's a fluid layout. I also wanted to show you a variation on that is a 2-column fixed. Now the difference between the fluid and fixed is that the fixed does not change size. That main article is always this wide, and the list of links is always this wide. It never is allowed to get bigger or smaller. This was a much more common design before we learned how to control floats and use media queries to create some responsive designs where the design changes from screen to screen size. And I know that there were at least a few questions in the chat room, the Slack chat room, about this. That is actually something that we focus on in web design too quite a lot, responsive design. So if you're interested in that, registration is open now if you'd like to sign up for Web 2. So why am I showing you the fixed and the fluid designs? Well, these two designs both use floats in slightly different ways, and I want you to see that so you can apply the float property in your Zen Garden design. So, a note about these designs, the widths that we specify in them don't really have any padding or margin or border on them, or very much at all. So if you were to add padding, it would probably break the design because that would add to the width of the item. You can control that with the border box, the box sizing property, and setting that to border box, as was covered in the book. That I think it was either this chapter or the previous chapter. That's something that I recommend when you're trying to add padding and borders in. However, these examples, there are really no borders at all and no padding to interfere with our widths. So that was just an aside I wanted to mention before we got too far in it. So let's talk about that fluid layout. The strategy here is to float just one of the columns, and I think it's the main column, to either the right or the left. In this case, we float to the left, and add a margin to the other column. Then all you have to do is clear the footer element to keep it at the bottom of the page. And I don't need that dash in there. So let's take a look at this. So we've got a header and a footer. And on the left, we've got this main article. On the right, we have what I'm going to call the aside. If we look at the source code for this page, let's go down to the HTML. You'll see here's the header, here's the main, here's the aside, here's the footer. That is all the HTML that's on this web page. The CSS, I took the CSS that she used in her article and really extended it a little bit. The first thing that I did was add back the outlines. Remember, an outline is like a border, but it doesn't add to the width of the element at all. So it's actually safe to add that here just so that you can visualize and kind of debug visually where everything is appearing. So I have added a little bit of styling to the header and footer to set a background color and add some spacing. I took out the padding and margin on the body tag so that everything touches the sides of the window. And the main event here is on these three selectors. I selected the main, the aside, and the footer. The footer is the element that clears left. So I wanted to make sure that the footer always appears at the bottom. So I set that clear property, and it makes sure to look all the way to the left and to start once everything has finished up here at the top. So the footer makes sure that there's nothing on the left when it starts. Why did I choose left? Well, that's because the main column is what I decided to float to the left. You'll see that we set a width of 60%, and then the margin has about 5% on both the right and left. This is that outline property that I mentioned. So really what we have going on here is one floated element, the main, is floated to the left. Then, on the aside, there's no float on the aside here. This is actually just kept in normal flow. But what we do is we add a margin to the left-hand side to make room for the main article. So if I open up the web inspector, I can probably toggle a few properties on here, and you can see the effects of them. Let me select this aside, and I think the property that will be most instructive here is if I turn off the margin left. So there's a line through margin left. Because the aside is in normal flow, it is allowed to start all the way on the left-hand side here. And the text kind of interferes with the main article. So that main article is completely floated to the left. It is taken out of normal flow. And that allows the collision between these two boxes. So margin left was set to the width and the padding or the margin that we had added onto that. So the width of this I think was 60%. We added 5% on each margin. So we made sure that the margin left was 70%. So that the content didn't overlap. Now let's look at the footer. If I turn off that clear left, it doesn't actually cause any problems. I think we get lucky in this because there's not a lot of text in the main article. Let me tweak that just for a moment. I'm going to go into this main article and I'm going to add a paragraph tag, and I'm going to add that cool lorem ipsum text and refresh the page. So without the clear property on the footer, because the main article is taken out of normal flow, content is allowed to overlap it. So this box here, the copyright information, now appears on top of the main article. So we had to clear the left to make sure that everything that was floated to the left has room to be presented on the screen. So let's review that. So get rid of some of this lorem ipsum now. There's really not a lot of CSS here, and most of it she removed when she put it in the article because you didn't need to see the background color information. The magic is the float, the margin left, and the clear property. Then they adjusted the width and the margin appropriately so that there was white space between the columns. But with this, you can make a 2-column design. Now, in her strategy guide, she talks about how you could have chosen to float to the right. If you decided to float to the right, then you would probably have to clear the right as well. Those two should pair together. And I'm going to check the chat room because I see some questions here. Oh, yep, someone else just joined and said hi. So hello in the chat room. So that is the 2-column fluid example. I will make sure that this file is posted so you can look at both the CSS and the HTML. The next one that I wanted to cover, I had all of them open. Hold on just a second here. I'm going to open up this whole week in Atom again. There we go. Those are the files I needed. All right, so that was the fluid. The strategy is a bit different when you want to have a fixed width. And I want to show you 2 variations on the fixed width. One where the content is all the way to the left and one where the content is centered in the page horizontally. The strategy here requires additional HTML, and it's actually HTML that's a lot like the CSS Zen Garden. Wrap the entire page in a div and set it to the width that you are hoping to achieve as the fixed width. Then you can specify pixel values for the floated elements to specify their size in the column. And the floating and the clearing method is pretty much the same as what we used before in the fluid layout. So let's take a look at the fixed design. Let me pull that up. So you'll see that at first it kind of stops suddenly right here, but there are 2 columns still. There's the main article and the list of links. Let me pull up that HTML. The HTML is exactly the same. In the middle, there is one addition. This div with an ID of wrapper has been put around the whole page's content. And that should feel familiar in the Zen Garden because they do that quite a bit. So that's the additional HTML. If I scroll up, some of the CSS is the same. Where it starts to get different is now there is a selector, an ID selector, that starts with this pound sign or the hash symbol, that selects that div that had an ID of wrapper, and that's where we set the width. Now, if you chose a different width, you could choose a much smaller width, like 500 pixels. And that is what is controlling the width of the main page content. You'll notice that because I didn't update some of the other widths, things are exploding outside of that 500 pixels. But I could have just as easily bumped that up to like 1500 pixels. And now that bar extends further over and the page scrolls. I'm going to leave it at that 960 that we started with because that fits in a lot of laptop screens. I think that would be an appropriate size for the Zen Garden if you are working on it. Obviously, it's not going to work great on phones, but it'll work for most screen sizes, which is important for the Zen Garden. So that's the new element that we added CSS for. What's different about the main and the aside? Well, again, their widths are now not percentage based, they're pixel based. And the big difference here is we have chosen to float both of them. And this is very common in the mid website because sometimes we have 2 columns, sometimes we have 3 columns, we have a lot of things going on. And what we have decided to do is always float everything in one direction. I know that a lot of you are probably playing with the Zen Garden and sometimes you're floating something to the left and something to the right. Trust me, I have some tips at the end I'm going to go over. Floating in more than one direction is just going to lead to heartache and misery. Pick a direction and float there so that you can see the content stack up left to right on the page. So I usually float to the left. So I float the main to the left and the aside to the left. Why do they fit next to each other? Well, there is no margin, or there's no significant margin on the left of the aside. Now, the main is floated to the left. It's 650 pixels wide. And then the aside is also floated to the left, 250 pixels wide. And they kind of stack onto each other, kind of like a weird horizontal Tetris. These puzzle pieces fit on top of each other. So let me go back to that. So the main article is floated to the left, and then the list of links is floated to the left. They will sit on top of each other. We could actually have more content in here that's floated to the left, and it would just wrap around underneath. But then the footer has to have this clear. Now, one thing that I noticed that was different here is this footer was touching my blue box and my red box at first when I first copied the fluid design and tried to make the fixed design. And that's because when these are taken out of normal flow, they can't have a bottom margin that affects any other content. That's just not how the clear property allows it to work. So what I had to do when I was in this design is I had to actually, the footer couldn't have a top margin. So I had to actually add the bottom margin to the main so that it would push the footer down. I said that backwards the first time. I'm sorry about that. So those are the differences there. I wanted to talk about a variation of this that you'll see on the mid website where the content isn't squished all the way over to the left, and that is the margin auto trick. You've seen this already in a couple exercises. Remember the treble mnemonic. This is the top and bottom margin. This is the left and right margin. When you set the left and right to auto, that actually will tell the browser to equalize the space on the left and right. So if I refresh this page design, auto on the left, auto on the right means that the content is centered. Now the text isn't centered on the page, but the content, the design is. And this works much better on all sorts of screen sizes when you split that extra size 50-50 left and right. So I think that this would be very helpful for the Zen Garden design, this strategy. So let's go over a few layout tips for me. First, pick a direction and float everything that way. Like I said before, I usually pick floating left for everything. The reason I like that is it causes everything to stack on top of each other in a predictable way. I wrote here that it feels like you're playing a sideways version of Tetris, and that's the way I like to think about it. If you turn on those outlines, which I'll mention in a minute, then you can actually see how the boxes are stacking on top of each other, or left to right. You'll also need some more container and wrapping div tags when you're using floats for designing. And that's because you're going to need to put something in there to clear. And having something that wraps around all the floated elements helps you with that. I also recommend as you're developing, let me get my video out of the way here. As you are designing your CSS Zen Garden and you're playing with floats, don't go crazy and add a bunch of floats all at once. Float one thing at a time, save, switch back to your browser and refresh. So you saw me doing this tonight inside of this design. I was in Atom, I made a change, I hit Command S, that would be Control S on Windows to save, and then I used the Command Tab, which brings up this switcher, and I would go back to Chrome. On Windows, that's Alt Tab, and when you're doing web design and you have a text editor up and you have a browser window up, you can actually Alt Tab back and forth like I'm doing here, and that little chooser window doesn't even show up. But this is what web designers for almost decades now have been doing here. They will save one little change and go back and hit refresh with Command R to see the change take effect. And I really recommend that more than ever with floats. Use the outline property to visually troubleshoot. I did that with these designs. I turned on this blue outline and this red outline so that I could see how they interacted. That also means that when you have your web inspector open, you're able to edit some of these CSS properties and see what happens. So if we floated the main to the right, you can see what would happen there. And the good thing about that outline property is it doesn't affect the width, so you could have a really big outline and it didn't shift the size of any of the elements. I mentioned earlier that that is simply not true for the border property. So as you add a bigger border, notice how the width changes and the design breaks. So I'm really happy that our author showed us the outline CSS property, and it can help you troubleshoot. So that is it for our old school layouts. Like I mentioned before, these are used all over the place on the MID website. In fact, I just wanted to show you, if you visit one of our web pages, like the winter registration is now open, you'll see that the design actually does have space, this white space on the left and right. It's more prominent when you're reading an article, and that is margin auto, so that we have the space split on each side 50-50. Now, of course, as you shrink this, we have some responsive design that changes the design a little bit as the screen gets smaller. We will definitely cover that in Web 2. But for now, starting with that fixed centered design, I think is a really nice, old school, reliable layout technique using floats. Okay, please post your questions in the Twitch chat room. I had a couple requests beforehand to talk about the midterm. And so I've pulled up the assignment page. This is the final assignment here. You should be able to see the rubric. I hope you can see the rubric. I would like you to review that because I know a lot of you are trying to get an awesome looking CSS Zen Garden design. What I have to tell you is that a majority of the points in your midterm are not actually connected to how it looks, but more related to demonstrating specific CSS techniques. There are points related to the originality of the design and how legible your design is. That's like most of the visual appeal. As you're going to be working with a color scheme this week, you do need to pick a color scheme for your Zen Garden design. But almost every other rubric item in here is a technical one, making sure that the CSS you write is in an external style sheet, that it passes the W3C CSS validator, that you have implemented color properties and font properties. All those are technical requirements. It gets a bit more technical here where I ask that you use specific selectors. So I'm looking for element selectors, ID selectors, class selectors. I'm also looking for you to add CSS background images, to use the box model for borders, padding, and margin. Using pseudo selectors so that links or other elements will change their design when you hover over them on the page. And then there's kind of a grab bag here where you can pick a couple other more advanced CSS3 properties like rounded corners with border radius, box shadows, RGBA colors. That A is the alpha transparency channel, so that you can adjust how much of the underlying content bleeds through the background, and opacity, which actually controls both the text and the background. So those are kind of a grab bag. You can use 3 of those things to great effect in your design. And then finally, making sure that your design works in more than just one browser, making sure that it works in Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. That's one way to check if you have any errors in your CSS, because each browser might have a different way of falling back and guessing at what you intended to do. So that's the rubric. If you haven't gone through it, please read through it. I would recommend printing that off if you can and keeping it next to you as you're working. This week, the draft is much smaller. I picked a few of the rubric items that I think are worth getting done this week, so that you have them out of the way and you can focus more on the rest of the requirements. So what do I want you to do this week? I want you to start your own style sheet, and I had a specific question about that before the live stream. So I'd like to show you how to do that. I know a lot of people were downloading the Zen Garden page when they were trying to look at the different CSS files, because there are links right on the front page for the HTML file and the CSS file. And you can absolutely download these. The only file that you really need, though, is the HTML file. So I'm going to click that. It downloads as index.html. And if you open that up in your text editor, oops, I dragged it onto the wrong one. I'm going to drag it onto Atom here. This is the HTML file. I have told you that you are not allowed to edit any HTML in this file. None at all. None at all. The only thing, here's my exception, is you want to connect your own style sheet. And you want an external style sheet. Each one of these Zen Garden designs uses the same HTML file. It just has one change right here. It's usually this href property of the link tag to choose a different style sheet. So this is where you would put the reference to Brandon style sheet, brandonstyles.css. So you are allowed to change that. You are allowed to change one more thing. If you want to include a Google font, you can add another link tag and put the Google font URL there for the fonts that you want to use. So this is how you get started. You'll need to download the index.html file, create your own style sheet. So let's change the body background color to red. This is going to be the ugliest CSS design. I'm going to put this in my downloads, save it as Brandon Styles, and if I open up my index, I now have a blood red for Halloween CSS Zen Garden design started. So in your draft, I would recommend that you get your style sheet created first. Then start adapting your own color scheme using background and color properties, kind of like I did, but not so scary that it will make your eyes bleed. Then I want you to write an ID selector, and this is where I need you to start looking through the Zen Garden with the web inspector or by reading the source code, because what you're going to find in here are a lot of elements that have ID properties. So if you wanted to change the background color of this preamble section, I can write an ID selector for Zen preamble. So let me do that here. Remember, ID selectors begin with that pound sign. There can't be a space after it. It has to be touching. And Adam is really good about color coding that so you can see. And we're going to change, that background color to blue. Again, this is going to be terribly ugly. But you can see that now I've changed the preamble to blue. And I have successfully written one ID selector. Now this is probably the most challenging one, the descendant selector. I always end up working with students to try to figure out where we can use that. If we take a look at what I've done so far with the Zen preamble, you'll see that there's actually an H3 underneath the Zen preamble. And I could have easily written a selector that changed all the H3s, but maybe I only want to change the H3 that's in the Zen preamble because it's a blue background, and I want this H3 to be a different color. So I could write a descendant selector, which starts out with the hashtag Zen preamble, but then has a space in H3, and maybe I want to change that color to white so that it's easier to read against the blue. So I'm going to save and go and refresh here, and now I've changed the H3s underneath the preamble to be white. So that is a descendant selector as you've been using. Then I recommended if you're going to use Google Fonts, you might as well get it out of the way, pick a couple that you want to use and get them added to your project. Like I said, that is used with the link tag. And then the only other thing I thought would be useful now that you're in the chapter about positioning is actually take a look at the bottom of the index HTML file. They have a few divs. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 divs that have classes of extra and then a number. So I would recommend that you play around with selecting one of these, like this extra one. Remember, class selectors start with a period, and try using absolute positioning with them. So that's the position attribute. And then we want to do absolute as the position, and then maybe you want to say from the top I want that to be 0 pixels from the top, or just 0, and then from the right I want that to be 20 pixels away from the right edge. That's a very terrible example, but then remember you have to specify a width on anything that you position absolutely, and I'm going to set a background color. Again, this is going to be so ugly, I'm sorry, of green. Now in reality this is where a lot of the designs will include a background image. So they'll take one of those divs that's at the very bottom of the page and kind of grab it and put it somewhere else, and give it a background image so that will appear on the page. If I've done this correctly, we are going to see a box appear in the top right. And it did not go to the top right. Where did it go? Did I not save? So it's from the top 0. What did I get wrong, my friends? Extra 1. If you see my error in the chat room, let me know. So it should have gone up to the top, and from the right edge, 20 pixels. Let's open up our friend the web inspector here. Go over to elements. So extra 1. Oh, I know what's going on here. There's no content inside of it. I feel silly now. So I specified a width, but I didn't do a good job of giving it a height. So let's make it a square. Whew. I feel silly. There we go. There's our 1x1 square. There's no content inside of it, so it's not going to have any words appear. If you were going to absolutely position something that had words in it, I'm sure that would be much more obvious right away. But if you were going to put a background image in here, you could specify the width and height. Maybe you want to take up the whole page. You could definitely do that as well. But if you look through a lot of those designs, I think the robot one, a few of the others are slipping my mind right now, but there's a lot of them that will take those extra divs and use absolute positioning to put them somewhere else on the page. So I think that those are good things to start playing around with now because of where we're at in the chapters. The draft is due this week. You are going to have next week to work as well. And what I would like to do is schedule conferences with every student. And I don't know if we're going to do this with some sort of like Google Hangouts or some other video conferencing software, or if we just want to schedule like a phone call. I'm going to think about that and post this weekend how we can sign up for conferences. But I'd like to go over your drafts one-on-one just to give you some feedback and help you get the design built that you want to build. So that is the midterm. I know that there's supposed to be a color scheme challenge that is not posted yet. I'm going to endeavor to get that posted tomorrow when this recording goes up. There's a question in the chat room. How do you set an opacity factor in a CSS file similar to the arrow glass style so images can be seen in the background or translucent? Okay, so I think what you're getting at is not actually using opacity. If I set the opacity of the Zen preamble here to 0.9, let's see if that's enough. That's not enough. Let's make it 50% opaque. So what you'll see is it changed the background color to let more of the red through. That's why you're seeing purple. But it is also it's also affecting the text. So the text now is lighter and even harder to read. This is where the opacity can be cool for affecting the whole design or the whole thing that you're selecting. What you might actually want is not to use opacity, but to use background color and specify it with RGBA instead of the normal hex value, because that last number is like an opacity, but just for the background color. So this is going to be red. I want it to be blue, right? So let's pump up the blue. Wait. RGB. There's the B. So I need that in the third place. So this is full blue, but 50% opaque. And now that's going to have an interesting effect where it lets the red through and it blends like into a purple. So I hope that helps you out here. I think you could probably do something similar by putting, the background image on some other div behind it and then setting a background color on top of it. I think there are also ways with CSS to specify multiple backgrounds, and that might be one way to put the color on top of an image. I think that's what you were asking as a follow-up. So play around with that. There are definitely ways to do this without having to use Photoshop to edit the image, for instance. So yeah, I think RGBA is definitely one of those grab bag CSS properties on the rubric. So down here in the rubric where I say to use 3 or 4 visual effects, this RGBA colors, that's exactly what I would expect when I'm looking for something cool from CSS to use. Okay, so are there any other questions? Let me go back. We've covered a lot of ground here. like I said, I will be sure to post this outline from the article with my 2 HTML files that you can use as examples when you're trying to play with floats. I'm glad that we talked a little bit more about the CSS Zen Garden. I can't wait to see what you all come up with. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me on Slack. Like I said, the drafts are due this week because I want you to get started. There'll be more work time next week, and we'll also do conferences. If there are no other questions, have a great night. I'm glad we could keep this one short, and I will talk to you all again soon. Bye.